cabled instrumentation that is designed to detect life, planning for missions to other watery bodies to look for other life in our solar system. And with that, please everybody join me in giving a huge welcome to Queens College to Dr. Deb Kelley.
Thanks, Dax, very much. So I'm super excited to be here. I wish I was in person with you guys. I've known Dax for quite a few years since he was a grad student here, and I've certainly enjoyed working with him. And I look forward to hopefully taking some Queens College students to sea with us this summer. So I want to introduce you. One of my great things I get to do is dive, and I want to use a robotic vehicle, and I'll show you that. But I want to share with you some places, amazing places in the sea that most people have never seen before, really cool animals. And then I'll spend some time. We were funded to put in the largest underwater observatory in the oceans that brings the internet right into depths of 10,000 feet or so, out to volcanoes and along the subduction zone. So I'll share some of that. And then, and the reason that that's so important is we've been sensor poor in oceanography, and we're never in the right place at the right time, usually to measure important processes that go on. And so when this cabled observatory got installed in 2014, it really forever changed how we can look at the oceans and interact with them 24/7. And all the data are streaming live freely, so anybody in the world can look at that. And I'll share with you some of the exciting discoveries that have been made because of that. I had a little bit different background, I think, than a lot of my colleagues, and Dax alluded to that. So as Dax mentioned, I was the first, well, myself and my brother sister were the first kids in all of our relatives or anybody to go to college. So that was kind of a new thing. My dad had finished 8th grade, and my mom was a secretary, and she finished high school. And they always wanted us to go to college or university, but they didn't really know what that was. I started out with a music scholarship because that's how I could afford to go to school, but I knew that wasn't what I wanted to do. 2 schools later, I ended up at the University of Washington. I started out in a community, well, in a small college, and then moved to a community college, which I was very grateful for because I got a great education there, and then moved to the UW in graphic design. And that was a 5-year program. And my senior year, I took a geology 100 class, and growing up in the Pacific Northwest, I loved looking at the volcanoes, and every weekend we would go out and pound on rocks and look at rocks and hike and camp, and I fell in love with that. So my senior year, I asked if I could switch to do a joint major between graphic design, which is a 5-year program, in geology, and graphic design said no. So I ended up in geology. I'm very grateful that I did. But I didn't, and then in 1980, so I'll date myself, but I took my only ocean class from John Delaney, who has now been my mentor and friend for 40 years. And he asked if I would work for him. And so I started working full-time and going to school full-time. And my first summer with him, he took me out on one of the old research ships called the Thompson. And I just fell in love with everything about going to sea, the people, the hard work, being out away from buildings or anything. And then in 1982, when we were out, this was all when I was an undergrad, it was right when underwater hot springs were just being discovered, and we just happened to take a big chain bag like the one shown on the left there and drag it across the sea floor, and we brought up massive sulfides from a place called the Main Endeavor Vent Field. And it was a huge discovery at that time because only a few vent fields had been found, and that really drove my career for ending up to where I am now in a large part. I think I've spent about 4 years at sea now in my life, and I never get tired of it. It always renews my soul. And I should say that one of the lessons I learned was, although it was hard in undergrad, because it was new to me, and I didn't have really a family that understood what I was doing, John instilled on me to follow my passion. And so I ended up graduating with 300 credits, which I don't think they let you do anymore, but I was never sorry and haven't looked back for that. So why do I do this? You know, the oceans are clearly the last unexplored frontier on our Earth. And there's two huge opportunities for discovery. More and more as I get older, I think more about why I'm doing what I do. And before it was, you know, just a ton of fun and I love the discovery process, but more and more I think about the health of our planet and, you know, the recognition that the oceans really govern the health of our planet. And so how we get better at understanding them and managing them is really important to me. The fun part, most fun part of my life is going to sea, as I mentioned, diving in some of the most, you know, the oceans host some of the most extreme environments on Earth, underwater hot springs. Oceanography didn't start out this way when I was first joined oceanography. We'd go to sea with mostly geologists, but now I get to work with world experts in all different kinds of disciplines and bring engineers out to sea with us, students, and I really enjoy that teamwork and getting to know people. And then it always humbles me because, you know, especially on new expeditions, often we'll see places that nobody's ever seen before. And that's a pretty remarkable experience to go through. And then also we get to work with cool toys, and I'll show you some of those toys, so to speak. So, you know, I grew up learning about photosynthesis and the energy from the sun. And in oceanography, you know, most people, particularly when I was starting out, you know, 30 years ago, I guess now, people would focus on just one or two processes or one or two organisms. And this is just a cartoon that shows some of the processes and animals that are driven by the sun and oceanographic, more shallow oceanographic processes. But as you go deeper, which is where I study, this is down right now. I focus on mid-ocean ridges. All the energy from that is driven from the, you know, the Earth, center of the Earth, and magma heat sources that come up from there. And I focus most of my work on the mid-ocean ridge spreading centers, although I'm starting to work more and more in subduction zones. And so the place where I work is really the thinnest layer of the ocean crust. So maybe a kilometer to the seafloor to maybe depths of 8 kilometers is where I focus most of my attention. And it's that where the spreading centers are spreading apart, where they're driven by convection cells, deep convection cells in the mantle. This is where I focus my research. And although I didn't think about it at the time, you know, now as I mentioned, I think a lot more about why I do what I do. And most people don't know, because the volcanoes are underwater, that 70% of the world's volcanism occurs underwater, and they really form the face of our planet. The mid-ocean ridges where the plates are spreading apart form the longest mountain chain on Earth. There's hundreds of thousands of underwater volcanoes. There's eruptions going on every single day, but we never are there in the right place at the right time. And maybe only 2 to 3 of those eruptions, and not on mid-ocean ridges, but elsewhere, have been found, been looked at right when they were erupting. So there's a lot of processes that we don't really, because we can't witness those processes underwater, there's a lot of things that we still don't understand very well. The hydrothermal vents or underwater hot springs are a really important source of metals. For young students now in your generation, you will be faced with thinking about metals, where metals are from, and it turns out that there are plans to mine a lot of the seafloor, and that has a lot of implications in terms of the environment. So I spent a lot of time like that. I worked on the island of Cyprus for my PhD, and there's 91 million-year-old underwater hot springs that are preserved, and they mined copper from there, and it changed the Roman history. It changed them. It was the world's source of copper for a long time. And so we will be going back into the oceans and looking at underwater hot springs as sources for mercury and gold and things like that. My favorite is again looking at underwater hot springs and understanding hydrothermal flow, and more working with biologists to understand the amazing life forms that live in these environments, everything from microbes to larger animals. And then also these volcanoes can be very dangerous. It's not a mission ridge spreading center, but off of New Zealand, there's a underwater volcanic chain, a few of the volcanoes right to the surface. And When they started recognizing how explosive these can be and how hazardous, the shipping industry, actually, the cruise liners actually changed the paths of their cruises now because they don't want to drive over underwater volcanoes. But most people don't know they're there because they are underwater. This is a satellite generated image of the mid-ocean ridge or the ocean basins. And what I'm showing here is all those little colored pinnacles are underwater volcanoes. Some of them are active, some of them aren't. The smallest, the long little purple guys, blue things, are about 3 kilometers in radius and up to 100 kilometers, where you see the Hawaiian chain coming in. So when you think of back to that first slide ago where I mentioned that, you know, we've only seen 2 or 3 of underwater eruptions, and you look at all these volcanoes, many of them are extinct, but they actually still have hydrothermal or fluids circulating through them. You know, this is a huge, huge part of our planet that we don't have access to. And out of all of these hundreds of thousands of volcanoes, we've only visited a few of them in any detail at all. So if you're interested about, I always thought when I was growing up and even in grad school that that I wouldn't make any discoveries, and it turns out, you know, the oceans really are ripe for discovery still and will be for a long time. So this is, you've probably seen a map like this. That red line that runs around the oceans like a seam on a baseball is where the mid-ocean ridges are, and that's where the youngest, hottest rocks on the planet are forming. And as I mentioned, there's probably eruptions going on all the time there, but it's not where we get to go very often. And then these, if you embed that seam in your head and then look at, they define, many of those define the building blocks of our planet, the tectonic plates. And for pretty soon, I'm going to dive into the Juan de Fuca plate, and it's this great little plate off of Seattle, off of Washington and Oregon. And it's about, if you go from Seattle to the boundary of that red where it turns into blue, it's only about a day and a half of steam on a ship. So it means that we can get in and out of there really fast, for ships anyway. And all the processes that go on there are really exemplified processes going on in other mid-ocean ridges and other plates. And so that's why we had chosen it to build the first US underwater observatory. So one of the places we can go is, and this is when I was, did a lot of field work in Cyprus. We've also been to Iceland, and Iceland is on a mid-ocean ridge, but it's a volcano that's been active for millions of years. And so it built up enough to break the surface. And you can go there. It's a fabulous place to go. I never traveled when I was younger because we didn't have money. And so one of the great things that I really am grateful for is that in oceanography, we get to go to these fabulous places and have our way paid. And so you can go to Iceland there, and this is basically where the spreading center cuts through Iceland. And on the left, there's the North American plate, and on the far right is the Eurasian plate, and you can walk through the Rift Valley and look at outcrops that you never get to see when you're diving in a submarine or using a robotic vehicle, because light doesn't travel very far in underwater, and you don't really get, it's very hard to get a 3-dimensional picture. And so places like Iceland and Cyprus, and there's oceanic crust exposed in Oman, are places where we can, one, take students and let them explore what the seafloor looks like, but also learn a lot about the structure and deformation and how the ocean crust gets altered over time. Another thing about Iceland that I realize, it has a lot of hot springs, which are fun to go to, relax in. So we can work on exposed oceanic crust on land that's old, or places like Iceland where the volcanoes have broken the surface. But most of my life is spent actually using robotic vehicles. And so I'll share a little bit of how we get to the seafloor. The US has 4 major global class research ships that they use, one of them at NOAA, and then 3 at oceanographic institutions, and the UW was the first one to get this class of ship. They're called the Egger class, and they're actually owned by the Navy. The one on the right is the Thompson. They're about not quite 300 feet long, and the one on the left is Atlantis, which hosts the submarine Alvin. These can stay out for 6 weeks at a time. Usually about 6 weeks is the limit for for food for one thing. And also after 6 weeks, people, it's tough out there. And so people like to get back on shore after 2 weeks. The longest cruise I've been on is continuous, is 2 months at sea on the ocean drilling program. When I first started going to sea, and said I was going on a cruise, my family thought I was going on a different kind of cruise, a luxury cruise liner. These ships are really working ships. And so the cabins are, they're nice, they're roomy enough. Almost all the cabins are shared except for the chief side cabin. On the Atlantis, you can tell it's the first class cabin because it has a window. Typically the ships have a small gym. Our tanning salon is the steel beach. And then for recreation, we play ping pong. And one of the interesting things about ping pong is if you're on a rolling ship, it's rolling 15, 20 degrees, playing ping pong is of interest. The ships are quite expensive. They're funded predominantly by the National Science Foundation, although the Navy funds some of the time. They're about, with a robotic vehicle on board, the day rate is about $70,000 a day, not counting people. And so there's a very rigorous, because that's taxpayers' money, right? And there's a very rigorous program that we go through to get funded to go out to sea. And we write proposals. They get reviewed by a committee of usually our competitors through the National Science Foundation. They meet and rate the proposals. And then out of those, they pick the best ones. And then the heads of different programs within the National Science Foundation, they choose the cruises that will be funded for that year. And sometimes it can take 3 or 4 years before you get funded. You have to submit your proposal a couple times. So it really is a very, very rigorous process. And we take pride in what we do there. Because it is expensive and we don't get to, on most science programs, not the cable array, but this other normal science programs, you know, we maybe only get to go to sea once during the entire summer or once every 3 or 4 years. And so operations, we try and run very efficiently, 24/7 operations. It's kind of strange if you told me that I would have to get up at 3 in the morning on land, you know, and get 3 hours of sleep and then get up again, I would be kind of cranky. But out there, your mindset is very, very different, and it just seems like a normal routine and you don't think anything about it. Coming off of Oregon and Washington, our weather window is usually June and September in the Northeast Pacific. Once you get into September, October, these big storms come through, and we can still get big storms in the summer too, but you know, if it's blowing 80 knots and there's 30-foot waves, you really don't get a lot of work done. They basically lock you inside the ship. And so we try and get the best weather window we can so that we can make sure that we get our work done. Safety is above anything else on the ship. The captain is controlled of that. And before we leave the dock, everybody has to go through a pretty serious training for safety, including putting on these emergency suits, which are kind of interesting to get on. They're not that easy, but they teach you, you know, about fire extinguishers, who to call, all that kind of thing. So it's a great photo opportunity for students. I have been fortunate enough to dive. I still remember my first dive in Alvin. This is the old Alvin. There's a new one that came online about 4 years ago now, but it looks functionally the same. It's the only deep diving human occupied submarine in the US. It's a total workhorse. It's very, very safe. There's a very, very rigorous safety checkout that they go for. It also is actually operated or owned by the Navy. And if there was ever emergency, they would pull it off site and see if they could get it to a place if there was some kind of emergency deep down, because it dives deeper than actually most of the Navy subs too. So I still remember my first dive. The vehicle is run on marine batteries. It has manipulators or arms that are hydraulic. They come out of the medical industry and ROV industry or oil and gas industry, and they have force feedback. And I'll show you a close-up of one of those. But basically, you know, when you're diving, the pilot's looking out the window. There's one pilot and then 2 divers. And they can tell with these manipulators, force feedback means if you're going to sample an animal and you grab onto it, you can actually tell what strength you're grabbing onto it so you don't crush its legs or things like that. So there's pretty amazing technology that goes into this. The dives usually start about 6 in the morning, the pilots get up and start working on the sub. They get everything ready. The divers, the night before, they'll put their usually warm socks and a sweater or something in a pillowcase, and then that gets loaded into the vehicle. Because people are involved, the safety routines are really critical. Before you ever dive in a sub, they put you in and close the hatch. And it's a big titanium sphere, which is shown here. And they close the hatch and sit with you for an hour and go through all the emergency procedures to make sure that you're not claustrophobic like that. This is inside when I was diving, I think it was the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. In the old vehicle, you can see it has a little tiny porthole. In the old vehicle, you would lay crosswise. I would get in, we usually get in the water or in the sub about 7:30 in the morning. And then at 7,000 feet, it's about an hour and a half to get down there. The dive length can be up to 8 hours, but if you're driving around, you use up a lot of power. And so sometimes you only have 4 hours on the bottom. And then the vehicle has to come up in daylight by usually about 4 in the afternoon, because often there'll be, there's a lot of components on the vehicles, and things can get ground faults and issues can happen. So the pilots will repair whatever issue happened on the dive, as well as preparing for the next dive. And so they don't want to stay up till 2 in the morning and then have to dive the next day. It's really fun. It's amazing. My first dive was on an eruption on axial volcano, where I'll take you in a little bit. Always the most advanced pilot. So I dove with John Delaney often. He's about 6 feet tall, a little over 6 feet tall, which is the cross length of the vehicle. So his feet were always right on my shoulders. They are very careful about, you can't wear any perfume, you can't wear any synthetic clothing, because they're worried about fires in the sub. They keep the oxygen quite low. Right behind my head in the sub, there's an oxygen scrubber, but they're always worried about fires, and so they keep the oxygen low. It's super tiring. On the first dive, I was mostly worried that I might make a mistake, but as you get in the vehicle and it starts diving, it's this really beautiful, aqua blue colored water. And then usually around 600 feet down, you're in the dark. The vehicle's pretty quiet. It dives about 75 feet a minute, but you have no sense that it's going down. There's no sense of movement. You're beneath the waves. And I always put my head right against the window. It's completely dark, and you can see all these bioluminescent critters flying, going past the window. I always thought it was like diving through the stars or falling through the stars. And then about 300 feet off the bottom, they turn the lights on. And the reason they do that is to keep the power low. And I still remember seeing the bottom for the first time, and there was this gigantic lava flow that we landed or were right on top of. And one of the first things that really startled me was we were over 300 miles off the coast and super clear, and you forget that you're in the ocean because it's so spectacularly clear there. I love diving. I don't get to do it very much anymore, but I would drop anything to do it. It's kind of interesting. So it's cold. That's why I'm wearing a sweater. Typically where we dive, it's near freezing when we get to the bottom. And you're sitting there for 8 hours and curled up in a little fetal position usually. And so one of the analogies, it's hard to visualize or think about what it's like down there. So there's a diver on each side and then the pilot in the middle. And one of my analogies is if you could cram 3 people into a Volkswagen Bug at night and take them up in the North Cascade Mountains, which are tall mountains, lots of snow-covered mountains around us, and don't have a map. When we were first diving, we didn't have very good maps at all. Open the windows because it's cold, and then drive around with a flashlight and try and figure out where you are. And that's kind of what it's like down there. But again, I would drop anything and dive again, because it's, there you're really involved in the environment there. This was a video that some students made that we've taken a lot of students out to sea with us. And I like this because it will share with you what the ship looks like. This is the Thompson. It's completely naked pretty much when we first get on. And this was loading the robotic vehicle called Jason, which I'll share with you in a minute. This is at the UW Oceanography dock. It's a really exciting time. It's one of my favorite times. Everybody's working really hard. We load everything from our toothbrushes to computers to, you know, all the gear that we need. At $70,000 a day, you don't want to forget anything. So really be careful with checklists. These are vans for the robotic vehicle. You can see they're pretty heavy. The ship is rocking back and forth. Yeah, we take digital art students. So the students are really diverse that we bring to sea with us, everything from med students to engineers to informatics students, to give them that opportunity to go to sea and experience what it's like out there and learn more about the ocean. So it's pretty intense time. It's usually 3 to 5 days of mobilizing. You can see this is the main lab on the ship. Now it's almost always filled with computers and engineering gear for the cable array. And then when we leave from the UW, like we will this summer, it's about a day and a half to get out to the volcano. This is all freshwater here. We're going through a small lake area, open area, and then through there's Ballard locks that go from the freshwater system down into Puget Sound, which is salty, that enters out to the ocean. So you get on the boat, and usually by about midnight or so, you're out and actually get out of the Straits of Juan de Fuca. But this was a great, I thought they did a nice job for giving you a sense of, you know, how much gear you get on board and how empty the ship is when you first start. So more and more, starting in late 90s, I think, we started using robotic vehicles. And they have all the functionalities of Alvin, of deep diving submersibles, but they're not human occupied. And so they have a fiber optic cable that connects the vehicle to the ship, and that provides power. So there's no limitation for how long you can stay down. You can stay down for 2 or 3 days if you need to, and you can work 24 hours a day. It has the same kind of manipulators, and all the data are transmitted to at the speed of light up into a control van or control laboratory. And this is a shot of one of them with the robotic vehicle called Jason. And there's probably, I don't know, 30 screens now, maybe 15 cameras on the vehicle, and sonars, and all that data is coming together in real time. And what I really like about this is that it's incredibly interactive. We can have all the students in the control room at the same time, engineers. And Alvin, you know, when I was diving off mostly with geologists, we would see an animal and we didn't know necessarily if it was a new animal that no one had seen before. It's very hard to talk to up to the ship from Alvin. And so this is incredibly interactive. And I really enjoy that being with students and engineers and having discussions about what we're seeing and what we're doing. And it's a great way to train students and let them see this bottom of the sea at the same time we're seeing it. So it's an exciting place to be. So when we first started working off the coast in the Endeavour system, which is the hydrothermal vent system off Vancouver Island, it turned out is probably one of the probably top 3 active hydrothermal vent systems in the world's oceans. We didn't know it at the time. And we went out there and did a variety of projects, one of which we took a chainsaw and cut off some hydrothermal vents, some hot springs. And when we came back 2 days later, that rock on the left there, that fluid coming out of that chimney was about 700 degrees Fahrenheit, and the rock had grown 6 feet. So imagine if you're sitting there staring at a site, you know, and a rock grows 6 feet in 2 days. It's pretty amazing. There's another place where there was a chimney, a sulfide chimney that was venting over 300 degrees sea fluid, and we'd gone out there every year and we were looking for it. It was 150 feet tall and it had fallen over. So a lot of the processes, if you think of big storms, volcanic eruptions, landslides, a lot of the processes that go on in the oceans were just not there in the right time to measure them. And a lot of that heat chemical is really when the biggest fluxes occur, the biggest changes. And so John started thinking 2 decades ago, a little more than that now, how can we bring in the ocean, have a 24-hour presence every year, all day long, 365 days a year. And so about that time was when submarine fiber optic cables really came into their being and the internet was being born. And so John got together with a lot of researchers in the US and Canada and came up with the idea of installing an underwater cable observatory. And we worked early on with Canada, and they got funding before us. And so they have up there where you see ONC, Ocean Networks Canada, they have a fiber optic system kind of like ours. And then ours is called the Regional Cable Array. It's very high power. I'll share with that in a minute, but it gives us basically for the first time internet directly into the ocean. It's funded by the National Science Foundation. When they funded it, they want to keep it sustained for at least 25 years. There were over almost 300 scientists involved in the science when we were planning the sites for the Cable Observatory. And it spans coastal environments from about 80 meters water depth out to axial volcano, which is about 300 miles offshore. And then also we have sites along the subduction zone to look at magnitude 9 earthquakes when it does occur, and hopefully have earthquakes before then. Well, we definitely have earthquakes before then. So it's a really big engineering feat. We had about a $90 million contract with L3 Maripro using a telecommunications ship that lays fiber optic cables all around the world. And they built the primary infrastructure, which is those 2 black lines that run from Pacific City, one out to axial seamount, and then one that goes to the base of the subduction zone and turns east off of Newport, Oregon. The primary infrastructure provides all the power and bandwidth. So about 10 gigabits per second and 8,000 watts of power. So a lot of power. And then the secondary infrastructure, I'll show examples of this. It was all built either off-the-shelf instruments that industry has built, or ones that researchers have built if they're very specific, like those that go in hydrothermal vents. And then they also built the moorings. We have moorings that are 2,700 meters tall. There's nothing like them in the world's oceans. They're state of the art. I won't spend much time talking about that, but you can look online. And we actually have now over 150 instruments that bring all the data in real time. Early on, when we were first designing it, one of the requirements was it had to be very expandable. Technology changes. We knew that people would be interested when we installed the cable. We have about $35 million now of outside funding from researchers that are adding instruments onto the cable. It's interesting. I wonder when that was. And so I wanted to show you this. It's hard to get a sense of scale, I think. So this is the footprint of the Cable Observatory. If you started in Seattle and laid it eastward, it would cross 3 states. It was an amazing engineering feat. Imagine if you were flying a helicopter above the clouds at night and laying fiber optic cable across basically volcanic landscape. And you can't see what you're laying it across. And that's basically what the telecommunications ships do. They steam at about 8 knots, laying fiber down on the sea floor. And it has multiple kinds of sheaths to protect the cable. But if you get a little nick in that fiber and seawater gets in, it basically destroys the fiber. So we're incredibly proud that nothing has ever happened to the cable. It's been very stable. And none of this would have been possible 10 or 15 years ago. What are those things? It's not on mine. Guess we'll live with it. So this is a primary node. Let me get out of this and see just one sec, guys. I have no idea where that came from. Never seen it before, but we'll just keep going. So the primary infrastructure, this is a several ton, about 12 foot across substation on the seafloor, and it provides all the power and bandwidth to the instrumentation. Again, about 10 gigabits per second, and then bandwidth, and then 8,000 watts power. We use materials and technology from the oil industry, and these are wet mate connectors that you can plug in. This is with a robotic vehicle. Think of it as plugging into your wall socket, but underwater. And every time you plug one of those things in, salt water and electricity don't go well together. We turn the ports off, and every time you plug in one of those wet mate connectors, it squirts out a little bit of oil and prevents water from getting into there. This is the cable ship that did all the work. They're really large ships. They're global class ships. The telecommunication submarine fiber optic cable industry is booming right now, so it's hard to get hold of them. They're about 500 feet in length, and this was the one, the dependable, that we used. To get to the primary work sites, we use these smaller substations called secondary junction boxes. And each one of those, where you see the wet make connector there, those orange connectors, each one of those is set up specifically for an individual instrument with special power requirements and communication requirements. And about 33 of those orange cables, they connect to the primary nodes. And with a robotic vehicle called ROPOS, we laid about 33,000 meters of cable on the seafloor to reach all the key experimental sites, and I'll show you those. Those have also, they've been built by the Applied Physics Lab. If you're interested in engineering, there's really amazing opportunities to come out to see and learn about engineering, but also because these were built by young engineers, they built them up from scratch, and so they're easily modifiable. And it's been a great, because we're at the UW, it's a teaching institution. We early on hired young folks so they could really come up through the ranks and be familiar with all of this technology. And it makes it easy to modify and quick to modify too. So why did we do the Northeast Pacific? As I mentioned near the very start of the talk, John and the community picked the Juan de Fuca Ridge and the Juan de Fuca Plate, because many of the processes that operate throughout the world's oceans associated with tectonic plates are exemplified off our coast here on the Juan de Fuca Plate. And so I won't talk about it, but there's with ocean acidification, climate change, global warming, anoxia events where low oxygen waters come up on the coast and devastate benthic communities. We've chosen these sites to get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of the science that we can do. And we also have big expansion capabilities. So the real-time monitoring of over 150 instruments, these are just some of the processes and some of the environments that we're looking at. I'll focus in because I love volcanoes and that's what I've studied for a long time. I'll focus in on Axial. It's a remarkable place. It's the largest and most magmatically active volcano off our coast. It's erupted in 1998, 2011, and again in 2015. And again, because these systems are very hard to access normally with a ship, you don't get out there very often. This has turned out to be an incredible discovery place for looking at volcanic eruptions, how melt in the subsurface deforms a volcano, how that's manifested by earthquakes. And when there's eruption, there's many hydrothermal events there. How does that change the life and the microbes that thrive on the seafloor? So I'll walk you through some of that. There's two big holding tanks of melt. The melt beneath the seafloor is about a little over 2 kilometers deep at the deepest site. And this melt, think of it as if you're looking at Hawaii, I've seen eruptions there. It's lava, but we call it magma when it's down beneath the surface. And that melt is about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit when it comes out. And it can be a very energetic event when that happens. And one of those is something that we know very, very little about, is when there's an eruption. We've only seen them a few times in the oceans. We've never been there when they're forming. You're injecting 2,000 degree lava into the subsurface, and that subsurface is water saturated with near freezing seawater. So it immediately vaporizes the water in the pores and the cracks in the subsurface. And that fluid turns to vapor, we think, and rises probably at supersonic, does a lot of cracking, rises incredibly fast above the seafloor. It can form, I think of it kind of as an ash cloud. It's not quite the same in a Cascadia-like volcano, but it can rise over 3,000 feet above the seafloor. And it is very energetic. They can be 20 kilometers across. They probably form within a day. And one of the cool things, not only does it carry gases from the volcanoes are carbon dioxide and water rich and have hydrogen sulfide, other gases, but beneath the seafloor, and I'll show you some examples of this, beneath the seafloor, there's microbes that live at some of the most extreme conditions you can imagine. And when there's a volcanic eruption, there's lots of fluids that come out in this plume, and the microbes are carried from the subsurface up into these plumes. And so they provide a great window in when we sample these, a great window to looking at life that thrives beneath the seafloor. But again, we've never witnessed them right when they're forming. So the volcanoes, one of the biggest discoveries ever, that really was a new paradigm when the hydrothermal vents were first discovered, is that before then people recognized that sunlight really drives photosynthesis and life on the planet. But when they found the hydrothermal vents, there was no sunlight down there. And so the recognition was that gases coming out of the volcano support microbes. They can live at over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And their metabolisms use gases that would kill us. Carbon dioxide, they can't take it, many of them can't take any oxygen. Hydrogen sulfide, they can process arsenic, they can use hydrogen, they love hydrogen. And they've probably been, hydrothermal vents, as long as there are oceans on our planet, they've been going. And so most people now think that that's where life started on the planet. The microbes, the deep biosphere, we don't know the deepest they can live. We don't know a lot about the diversity of microbes that live in the subsurface. And there's a hypothesis that if you took all the biomass on land and compared that to the life that lives in the seafloor, that it might rival that is on land. They're very hard to grow. We've only cultured, when I say we, the microbiologists have only cultured maybe 1% of them. We're using new genetic techniques, so we get to know more about them, but still, this is an area, the microbial life, their communities, their metabolisms, and also viruses is where a lot of the major discoveries are going to be now. And there's interest in these microbes because people are interested in pharmaceuticals from the sea now, and there might be applications in terms of when you bring these microbes up, they are, and stress them out, they produce different kind of antibodies. And so maybe as we are becoming more and more resistant to penicillin and tetracycline, things like that, but maybe we can get medicines from the sea. There's been 2 times in my life. One was I was absolutely astounded and couldn't even make up what I was seeing. One was a discovery that we made in 2000, which I won't talk about, called the Lost City Hydrothermal Field. This was in 2000. And then this is another one in 2011, and I'll show you some video. We went out there, this is the top of the volcano, the mountain. There's a caldera, or a big collapse zone with a cliff that's about 300 feet tall. And we were out there trying to survey, we were surveying where the extension cables would go, because laying extension cables on an active volcano is a process. So we went out there 3 months after this eruption. We didn't know where the eruption was at the time. And we were driving along a fissure system, or cracks, where that served as the conduits for the lava flows. And those orange dots, each of those orange dots is where we came up on these collapse areas in the seafloor. The slide on the right shows that. They're big pits that used to have lava lakes that have collapsed. And out of that, there were billions and billions of microbes in kind of a snotty material, exopolysaccharide that the organisms produce, as well as sulfur. And what happens is the organisms, that live in the seafloor, when there's a volcanic eruption going on, there's a ton of CO2 coming out of the volcano. There's because you have hot rock or melt down there, there's a lot of warm fluid circulating. And so what we think is that the microbes in the subsurface undergo this phenomenal bloom, and they come billowing out of the seafloor, billions of them. And they may act as sources for organisms in the upper water column. They can live at 90 degrees C. And when you sample the fluids in that white zone, all that is white bacterial mats. They take carbon dioxide and they produce methane. They're on the outer zones, they mix with seawater. And so on the outer zones where you see that brown material, those are orange mats of iron oxidizing bacteria. So this is a video of what it looks like. We had students out there, we're doing some engagement projects. And one of the fun things that we do to get across pressure is the concept of pressure, and what it does is we take styrofoam heads and styrofoam cups and take them down in front of the vehicle and watch as they get smaller and smaller in size. The bottom here is about 150 times the pressure that we're at now. And so you can see the head's getting squished and it's getting dark. So we're almost at the bottom. And as we get to the seafloor, you'll see some lasers that are about 10 centimeters apart that give you a sense of scale. And we're starting, this is one of those big lava lakes that had the roof of it, as the lava had solidified and crystallized, turns to glass actually on the top of it. The roof caves in as the lava drains out. And this is one of the sites where this microbial material was streaming from the seafloor. And I'd never seen anything like it. They'd never been filmed live. They've only been seen actually twice before this. If you could look at the top of this lava flow when it first formed, it looks like obsidian, it's glassy. And we thought it was an old flow at first, but all that was covered by microbes. And this is 3 months after the eruption. So you can see this amazing amount of material just flowing from the seafloor. And we still don't know a lot about it. We're guessing that they're quite common in the world's oceans, but we don't know because we haven't seen a lot of them. And I think it's just this remarkably beautiful landscape that was really special. We had people from all over the world. This was going on at like 2 or 3 in the morning. And so they were writing in, trying to make up names for all the different sites. And here you can see the glassy basalt. So it's just really remarkable discovery. And it's one of the reasons that we really want the cable out there so that we can see these things form, see how they evolve over time.
Visualize the most. Visualize.
Stop this for a sec. So one of my things that I'm most proud of is we took some students out on the Visions cruise that had never been out to sea. They didn't know much about vents, and they wanted to produce an engagement video about hydrothermal vents. And so I'll play this for you.
Visualize the most
I think they did a really great job.
You can imagine. What do you see? Mountains, deserts, glaciers.
It's only about 3 minutes long.
Maybe places like these come to mind. Places with harsh climates, scarce food, and no water. But what about a place like this? Located 300 miles off the coast of Oregon, an active underwater volcano called Axial Seamount protrudes from the seafloor, looming thousands of feet above the barren seascape. This dark setting has never seen the light of day, as sunshine barely penetrates 600 feet into the ocean. At these depths, there are conditions rarely observed on planet Earth. The pressure due to the overlying ocean is 150 times what humans experience on land. That much force is equivalent to having a Boeing 747 jet on your chest. Temperatures here are cold and constant. Throughout the year, day or night, the water lies just above freezing at 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Suddenly, sharply jutting up from the seafloor are columns of rock towering over 5 stories high. These pillars can be enclosed in so much bizarre life that the rock itself isn't even visible. And the strangest part about this ecosystem? Fluids reaching temperatures of 660 degrees Fahrenheit are continuously flowing out of these chimneys. That's over 3 times the boiling point of water at sea level. Indeed, some of the microbes thriving near the vents have the highest temperature tolerances of any organisms known on Earth. These structures are known as hydrothermal vents and are found in the caldera of Axial Volcano. Hundreds of similar vents are found in every ocean around the world and are created when seawater seeps miles down into the ocean floor and becomes superheated by volcanic magma, forcing it back upward far from where it entered. When the metal-enriched fluids meet near freezing seawater, they lose hold of these minerals and produce deposits that eventually build up to form these great stone monoliths. A mile beneath the waves, this thriving ecosystem can't depend on the sun for photosynthesis, as almost all other life does. Instead, the organisms living in total darkness need another source of energy, a source that comes from below instead of above. Bacteria harness the energy from the toxic chemicals seeping from deep within the underwater volcanoes through a process called chemosynthesis. The success of this entire ecosystem is reliant on these bacteria, as they are the base of the food chain. This environment is an obvious competitor for the most severe that the world has to offer, and yet its various processes are poorly understood at best. Novel instrumentation is currently being deployed into the ocean to provide high-quality data in hopes to better understand this underwater oasis of life.
So I think they did a really nice job. These are what these vents look like. This is where actually the NASA experiment's going to be this summer, where we're putting a big cabled platform out to has a high-end laser on it that can detect signatures for life, and they're interested in looking for how do you detect life on other watery bodies like Enceladus or Europa. And so this is one of the sites that we're going to focus on. I think they're beautiful. They have worms on them. These worms called two worms off of Mexico. They can grow up to 6 feet tall. In the Gulf of Mexico, there's worms associated, similar worms that can live for 100 years. The gradients here are amazing. So the fluids coming out of there are, this one's about 650 degrees, something like that, 700 degrees. And the organisms can live quite close. Often you can't even see, if you look, we're gonna drill inside of this. This is all metal sulfide almost, but because there's hydrothermal fluids full of nutrients that are leaking out of the chimneys and mixing with seawater, life just thrives there like crazy. And this is about a mile beneath the ocean surface, and you see limpets and worms, and so often you can't even see the rock because there's so much life there. We do see, so this is infrastructure. I won't go over this. It's a lot to go over, but this is the top of the volcano. All those white lines are extension cables. And then this just gives you a snapshot of all the instrumentation. We chose these instruments, things like seismometers, instruments that go into hydrothermal vents, trying to look at all the processes that happen on a volcano and how does the evolution of the volcano drive life. And so some of the more novel instruments we have are this instrument that goes inside of a hot spring and it sucks out fluid, and it also filters the microbial DNA so we can look at the evolution of microbes over time. We have an HD camera, which I'll show you. And I'm gonna only focus on a couple of these instruments, but if you go on our website, you can see this. This is our HD camera. There's been students from Queens College that have been using these data to look at the animals, which is really great. We focus on one of these chimneys that's about maybe 13 feet tall called Mushroom. And this camera goes on every 3 hours for about 12 minutes. It photomosaics the entire chimney. And so here we're trying to look at how fast the chimney grows, how do the animals evolve, how do they change, how do they migrate around. Twice a month it goes on for full 24 hours, and then once a month for 3 days. And one of the things we're interested in is, are the lights, do they attract animals? We think that some of these animals can see light coming from the vents, but it's not in our visible spectrum. So lots of different processes we're interested in here. I want to zoom in here. We do see larger animals. There's octopus down there, most of the bigger animals. So this is about 5,000 feet down. This is on the side of a big cliff on the volcano. Most of the big animals, they move really slow. And the reason for that is it's cold, it's near freezing. There's not a lot of food out there. So octopus are one of the bigger ones that we see. My favorite octopus is this guy. This was on the Endeavor site, about 7,000 feet down. That's an extinct hydrothermal vent there. And this is online. If you go to the Octopus Ballet, I'm going to speed it up a little. But it's this beautiful animal. And it's moving really slow because it's cold. The eyes there, they have these huge eyes. I don't really quite know what they see. The eyes are morphologically related to human eyes. And it's just a very peaceful animal. A lot of the animals, they seem to be a little bit territorial. So if we go to the same place each year, sometimes we'll see the same animal over time. But I think this organism, this animal, its head is about this big around, is incredibly beautiful and peaceful. And we just followed it gently for a while and watched it swim through the water. So I want to dive into this because as I mentioned, volcanoes are erupting all the time, and we never have access to those because it's very hard to be out there when they're doing that. These orange dots are where we have seismometers that measure how melt is migrating in the crust, how the volcano is deforming, and when an eruption is occurring. And one of the cool things was, so William Wilcock here at the UW, he is monitoring the earthquakes automatically. And again, this is all coming in real time. And in 2015, he sent us an email and he said, something is going on out there. And in 24 hours, there was over 8,000 earthquakes. These are small earthquakes. You couldn't measure them from land, hence you wouldn't know the volcano was erupting. So they were just coming in on top of each other, just pounding away. And let me see if I can change this. If you look, just a sec here. If you look right here, those are all earthquakes. All the blue dots are earthquakes. And that's when the seismic crisis occurred over 24 hours. So there were thousands and thousands of earthquakes. And then as the system evolved up to the north there, you see all those red dots. And those are waterborne events. We didn't quite know what they were when the geophysicists first started working on them, but these are acoustic signals transmitted through the water. And it turns out that those mark underwater explosions. A student of mine, when we were out there, took the ship and mapped out that, that white area that defined where the northern eruption was. And this is, if you could listen in real time, all those red dots are these explosion events, and this is what it sounds like underwater. So this was the first time we could listen to a mid-ocean ridge volcano live as it's erupting. And it turns out that it's also in the frequency of some whales, so they can also, which is one of the expert things that Dax worked on for his thesis, was whale migrations and whale calls using seismicity. So if you ever, hopefully he's given that talk. But this was a pretty interesting event going on. When we went, to give you a sense of scale, so this is the map that my student made. This is we landed right by this lava field right here. And this is what it looks like. It's about a 127 meter thick flow. We landed right near the toe, went up to the very top. It's over 400 feet thick. And this is what one of these big pillow basalts looks like. When they erupt underwater, the front of them, the lobe, it's like a toothpaste tube, bulbous material. They crack open, it lets a bunch of gases out, and that causes explosions. And then again, once again, on top of here, on the top of the lava flows, 3 months later, they were completely covered in microbes. And so, you know, one of the messages here is that life thrives incredibly well after these eruptions. They're nascent, they don't last very long, they're ephemeral. And we went out there the next year, and none of those were living anymore. So just to give you a sense for scale, if you're ever in Seattle, this is the Space Needle, and that lava flow was in thickness is about 2/3 way up the Space Needle. So I always like going up there, and gives you a really good sense of scale. It was an amazingly thick flow. So I'm almost done here. One of the surprising things was that when we went out there in 2015 and we're looking at one of our instruments that measures the deformation, when you pump melt into a volcano, the top of it starts deforming upward and outward, and that this instrument, bottom pressure tilt instrument, measures that. And we looked at that black material, and it's fine grained ash. So this is glass that's come out during a fissuring eruption. A scientist at Western Washington wrote a really nice paper of this. She's been studying eruptive signatures underwater at Hawaii. And it's always amazing to me that the amount of melt lava pressure that must have been within inside this volcano to have fountaining of lava a mile beneath the ocean surface forming this ash is pretty incredible. And it's pressures that are 150 times. How are we doing for time, Dax? You're on mute. Mute. I can't hear you.
Well, you're doing fine, Deb.
Okay, good, cool. I don't have too many more. So one of the cool things I mentioned is that this is, so it's the most advanced observatory in the world's oceans for underwater volcanoes, and it's probably going to be that way for a long time. Initially, you know, one of the hard things as oceanographers was all of our instruments were on batteries, and at that time, there was incredibly limited memory, or storage, which sounds crazy now. So people would put battery-powered instruments out, and a fellow named Bill Chadwick from OSU and Scott Nooner developed these instruments that would measure the deformation at the top of the volcano. And they put these out with batteries in the summer usually, and then they would leave them out and recover them the next year, hoping that they all worked. And so in this bottom graph here, you'll see the year on the bottom, and then how much change in elevation the seafloor has domed upwards about 7 to 8 feet. And then in 1998, it fell about 3.5 meters, so about 8 feet or so. And then marking the 1998 eruption that was down to the south. And then it slowly, as melt started filling up the magma chambers, the magma the roof of the magma chamber would dome upward. It deforms the top of the volcano. 2011, almost exact same uplift occurred. And then there was a 2011 eruption. And then in 2014 was when we finally installed the cable. So now we're getting all the data in real time. And you can see that the top of that is a little bit more domed up a little bit more in 2015. The seafloor dropped. It dropped about 7 feet over that same 24-hour period as the earthquakes occur. And now Bill is tracking the rise in the seafloor again. So you can go online. So we have these 3 data parts that are all, you know, with pretty close, less than a meter difference. And so Bill can, he's used a model, and you can look at this. And so every single day he brings in the data, and he looks at it over different time periods. And this is the only place anywhere in the world where we think we can forecast when the next eruption will occur. And so the dates right now, depending on a couple of the parameters, if you look at this blue dot up to the right, whatever that, it depends on how much deformation is going to occur and the rate of deformation. But somewhere right now around May 22nd or May of 2022 to February 24 is when he forecasts that the eruption is going to occur. And as that's happening, as we get closer and closer to that event, the seismic activity, as you start moving more and more melt around in the seafloor, the seismic activity is going to go crazy too. So this is going to be an incredibly exciting opportunity. I'm hoping for 2024, so we have some extra time to measure the things going on out there. So I think I have 3 more slides, but I just wanted to share with you that a lot of people think about satellites because they've been around a long time, and that, you know, that's how our communications occur. But that's not true. Almost all of our communications now occur on underwater telecommunication fiber optic cables. And this is a map of those that are going to be later are installed now. And what you can see is they wrap around, you know, a lot of the major countries. And turns out that a lot of them go off of Oregon and Washington. And so on top of that, what I've done is I laid where in green is where there's underwater cable observatories that are now installed. And then in red are where there are planned underwater observatories. And so, you know, when you think of the Internet of Things, at some point we will have enough instruments in the ocean, all bringing in data in real time, that you can start thinking of it as a weather map, right? And we'll be able to look at all these processes going on throughout the world's oceans in real time. And we're hoping that many of those countries have the data that are going to be live. And so having students involved and new eyes and thinking about, you guys are much smarter than I am in technology and computer sciences probably for sure than I am. You know, how do we get you guys involved in this, recognizing that you don't have to go to sea, you don't have to use expensive ships. You can be sitting there and explore all these data sets. And I always tell my students, because we've never had these kinds of data throughout the entire water column, I should say, at such high resolution, and it will have 18 instruments of different kinds in one setting, that no matter what data set you look at, you're gonna make a discovery. So just 2 more things. We have a great, if you're interested in this project, if you want to look at more images and videos of the seafloor, the technology we use, if you go to interactiveoceans.washington.edu, it's a pretty nice resource. We have, I don't know, over 3,000 images now. We have a biological catalog I'll show you in just a sec that the students have done. And we're developing a data portal now specifically for education, so that we can develop visualization tools that meet students' needs and have students engaged in developing those tools too. So this is one thing that I'm super proud of. It used to be, it sounds crazy now, but when we were diving, we wouldn't record video with the ROV because we didn't want to pay for storage, which is insane now. And the students were kind of irritated with us because they saw these amazing animals. And so they pounded on us. And now what we do is the students are in the control room working with us. There's always at least 2, often 3, and they log all the key information that's going on until they dive, but they also log all the most important videos of animals. And they've created this really remarkable catalog of one for axial seamount and then one for the coastal sites of all the best video and digital still images. And so there's really, that's one of the few repositories like this, and then information about the animals. So if you're interested in biology, it's a really nice resource. And then finally, I'll say that I didn't talk about it, but this is one area that Dax knows a lot about. We also have these broadband hydrophones. And not only do we have them on the volcano, but we have them in coastal environments. And one of the really amazing things is they pick up mammal calls, so whales, porpoise, things like that. And so this is, we're going to be making this live for folks. This is about maybe an hour off the coast. And the pinging is another instrument that we have going on. I could listen to this forever. There's a student of Williams, Dax knows, that was studying whale calls off of axial seamount and several time scale frame, I think it was 10 years. And she discovered that the vocalization of the whales are changing over time. And one of my favorite hypotheses that Williams shared is that these whales had been, their populations were decreasing because of whaling, but now they're coming back. And so one of the great hypotheses is that that the whales are changing their vocalization frequency. They don't have to yell as long to talk to their other whale friends. And I just think that's such a one. It would be fabulous and really uplifting if that was true. And so this year we have our undergrads here in oceanography do a senior thesis, and we have multiple students working with William to look at whole sections of like year-long sections of whale calls and figure out if the population's number of whales are increasing, if the calls are increasing. So it's a great example of student projects here. And then finally, I just wanted to say that it's one of the great things that it always humbles me is being able to take students to sea. And I've been really proud and honored to be able to take Queens College. As Dax said, there's 7 students coming out that have come out with this and have worked on projects. And so I, we'll offer that opportunity probably again this year. COVID's thrown a little bit of a kink into it, but every year we go out there. I would also say that if you're interested in finding out more about this, go on the Interactive Oceans site, but you're also more than welcome to email me. So I think I'll stop there and chat with you guys if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Deb. That was wonderful. We do have a couple of questions, absolutely, in the chat. If anybody has things that they would like to ask, feel free to toss them in the chat for now. And if it slows down a little bit, then we can open up the microphones. Steve, who went to sea with you a couple of last year, wanted to know with regards to the snowblower events, can they be tracked? And do we have a method for measuring height and dispersion of the microbes that result in the water column?
We do not yet, because it's a great question. We do not yet. We can do that when we're out there on a cruise by taking an instrument that can measure temperature and the amount of particles in the water. And so you can lower this on an electrical cable that sends a signal up to the ship and take this instrument up and down to the water column, and you can do it that way, but it's time consuming, and you're only able to do that when you're there. So one of the really cool things it's about, and we don't have any moorings on the cable and axial seamount up at the top. We have them at the bottom and not the top, but we totally want that. And so we're I think about to be funded to have a partnership with a company that's putting out a new instrument that will measure particles and currents throughout the entire 1,500 meters of water at the top of axial. And if that instrument works, I could imagine people putting in proposals to put 5 or 6 of these things out there, and for the first time measure the formation of one of those plumes and how they evolve over time. And one of the things that I would love to see is, my hypothesis is that maybe before an eruption that we start getting these blooms, because you could imagine as more cracking takes place prior to an eruption, that more CO2 is released, more heat is released, and that there's maybe these things are precursors during the eruptions, which would be really phenomenal if you could track those. So, great question, Steve.
Well, and Steve actually sent a follow-up. He said, do we understand how these microbes impact the local benthic organisms?
I know, but I would guess that a lot of these, there's things called scale worms, that they're grazers, and so maybe they come and munch munch on them. One of the cool things, so we go out there every year now we switch out about 100 instruments every year because they get biofouled and drift and things like that. And after the 2011 eruption, we were out at one site and there's these things called fried egg jellyfish. They're huge jellyfish. We'd never seen them before, and they were littering the sea floor, and the crabs were coming, spider crabs were coming and munching out on the jellyfish. And I think what happened is there was probably a plume event that created much more nutrients in the overlying water column, and the jellyfish probably underwent a bloom. I don't know why they ended up dying and falling to the seafloor. Maybe there's a biologist online that could tell me, but we've never seen them before or since. So it's, yeah, there's a lot of biological relationships we don't know yet.
Thank you. Mathila asks,
Hey, Mathila.
she asks, are there other
Hi,
possible
Dr. Kelley.
indicators of upcoming eruptions beside inflation and seafloor depth?
So yes, so there's the earthquakes that keep increasing as you get closer. There's a deformation in some places. So we are seeing an increase in temperature of the vents in the International District, which is another vent field. In some places like the East Pacific Rise, they measure carbon dioxide, and CO2 starts increasing, and hydrogen should also start increasing. So there are, we have an underwater mass spectrometer, which is a high-end instrument that is one of our troublemakers, and we put it down there so that we could measure some of the gases, but that's not been successful yet. But that's our hope sometime, is that we can measure both the temperature and the gases, because they should, as you start cracking more, when you put seawater into the ocean crust when it's hot and you crack those rocks, it creates a lot of hydrogen. So you should see that precursor also.
Mm.
So Max asks, is anyone quantifying the biological productivity during the hotspot events? And if so, how do they compare with more characteristic ocean systems?
No, not yet. And to be fair, it's because for those mega plume events, we've only been there. We've never been on an axial when they formed. They've been there weeks, months afterwards. And by then, a lot of the energy has already been released. You know, the plumes have stopped forming, and they still maintain their oval shape. But by then, you know, most of the gases are gone, and so we need to be there when they're forming. And one of the hopes is that we put a underwater autonomous vehicle that we can plug in that can fly around and measure these plumes and start quantifying things like that, because the productivity should be quite high. Yeah.
All right, so Lisa asks, do we know if there are chemosynthetic organisms anywhere else in the ocean floor other than at hydrothermal vents?
Yes, at methane seep sites. So anywhere where there's gases coming out of the seafloor, volatiles coming out of the seafloor, and especially there's going to be seep sites is one of them. They don't have to be hot. They aren't hot. They can be warm, but not hot. There they have chemosynthetic organisms that also use like methane and hydrogen sulfide. And some of those organisms, they have symbiotic relationships, just like what we have in our gut systems, and they actually produce energy. So tube worms are these cool animals. They have little, they were in the videos, and they have these little red plumes, and they're the ones that off of Mexico can grow 6 feet tall. And they don't really have a gut system. They suck in the mixture of hydrothermal fluid and seawater. They suck it in, and inside of them, they have a plastic kind of a chitinous tube that they live in, and they can't actually get energy. So they, inside of their system, they have chemosynthetic organisms that process hydrogen sulfide and other gases, materials from the vent fluids. And the tube worms actually get their energy from the microbes that are producing a byproduct. That's how the tube worms get their energy. So it's pretty interesting. But yes, chemosynthetic organisms are not novel anymore, right? There's lots of them around.
All right, so Alan wonders to what extent the growth of, is it lohi, southwest of Hawaii, is being monitored underwater?
Loihi, I do not know now. I know folks that have been working on it a lot. There was a hydrophone array on there, which is the woman that did the, Jackie, who did the work on axial, looking at the fountaining. That's one of the things she was comparing the signals to. There was a fiber optic cable on Loihi, but it was one of the first fiber optic cables laid, and it was strumming with the currents, meaning it was moving, and it was on a glassy lava flow, and they ended up losing the cable. But I don't think there's no real-time observatory on there now, but I know that they go out there quite often because it is a growing volcano, right? So it's good question. I've always wanted to dive on it. I know there's vent systems there in organisms. So.
All right, Dr. O'Mullen asks or says, I'm wondering if there have been attempts to quantify the increase in STEM career choices that result after undergraduate sea experiences. He asked this question as a faculty member who is confident that he would have been a lawyer if not for the opportunity to dive in Alvin as an undergrad, an experience that changed his life path abruptly.
Great question. We don't track all of our students. Unfortunately, I wish we did, but we don't. It's actually not a funded program. It's a anyway, it doesn't really matter. But it's funded in that we get 10 days of ship time a year to do this, and then I teach it every year. But qualitatively, I will say that most of the students that go out there say that it changed their lives, and a lot of them do go into STEM. I know that some of them have become grad students, and clearly that's impacted them to go on into STEM related fields. I actually, one of the reasons I love, and John started out, was taking there's 0 requirements. We do not care what the background of students are. Is that I think it's almost just as important to share the ocean with students. You never know what they're going to go into. One of my students we took out for 4 years, started working with us, made one of the biggest discoveries ever in the ocean as a undergrad, and was funded for 5 years by NSF to look at this place. He ended up going into policy, and I'm just as proud of him to do that as I am if he got his PhD as a researcher. So I think I totally agree we need more folks in STEM, but I think it's also important that we just raise the awareness, and hopefully students that go out share their awareness and what it's like out there and why it's important. But we should do it, and we just frankly we don't have the resources in some ways to do it right now. So, but qualitatively, I know for sure.
Anecdotally, of the Queens College students that have attended and finished and have now finished their degrees, we're 3 for 3. So
good, glad to hear.
All right, so Melissa asks, have there been any unusual behaviors of the deep sea organisms given La Nina or El Nino seasons? Have you any patterns related to those types of?
No, and it's probably because where we work so deep, the ocean temperatures don't really change very much, right, over time. So they're kind of they're immune to what's happening at shallower parts of the system for the most part. That doesn't mean that there may be, because there are, one of the places I always wanted to work off of New Zealand and in the Marianas, there's places where the hydrothermal vents are shallow, so they're in the photic zone. So you get this mixture of both chemosynthetic organisms that are using the gases coming out of the volcanoes and photosynthesis. And there, they are shallow enough you can dive on them with scuba diving. there I would guess that there might be some impacts, right?
All right, so we're at about 7 minutes past when we would normally stop. So we'll take just a couple more. Dr. Picard has a general question. It says, basically asks, how does this mid-ocean ridge compare to other spreading ridges in terms of seismic and volcanic activity?
Well, so it's an intermediate spreading center. It's axial it's formed above a hotspot, so it has more continuous melt source coming beneath it. It's erupting because of that. It has erupting more frequently. There's the Endeavor system to the north, which is also intermediate. We started their intermediate spreading, so about the size rate your fingernail grows. We've been out there since 1980 and never seen an eruption. We've seen a diking event where there was melt injected beneath the seafloor, but never erupting. So, so because it's a hot spot, it erupts frequently, probably as fast as the fast spreading centers. I did a lot of work in the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is a slow spreading system. And there, it might be 50,000 years between eruptions, depending on where you are, and the relief there is much. There you might have, thousands of feet of difference between where the eruptions are and the bounding walls. And they can be the valleys can be 20 kilometers across. And sometimes you get mantle material where there isn't even any volcanic rocks at all, which really changes the hydrothermal systems there. So it's very, very different for sure than slow or ultra slow spreading systems, Mid-Atlantic Ridge-ish, or Central Indian Ridge. Axial is probably more like the East Pacific Rise, which is a fast spreading center where there's been historical eruptions there, and it's poised to erupt again. So it's a little different because it has a big magma supply, basically.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. If you'd like, please join me in thanking Dr. Kelley for sharing this time with us. Obviously we'll have our normal lunch seminar in the weeks to come. You'll see announcements coming forward.
Thank you.
Dr. Kelley,
Pleasure.
Deb, would you stay on with us for a little bit after we close down the overall room?
I can do. I sure will. Thank you. Thanks, guys. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.